Welcome to Election Watch. I'm Rohit Kumar. It is the morning after the 2025 off-year election and day 36 of the now longest federal government shutdown in U.S. history. If you have questions about either of those topics, you're not alone. Joining me to provide some analysis are Todd Metcalf and Karl Russo. Todd and Karl, welcome.
Thanks.
So, Karl, voter turnout is a perennial topic of conversation during elections. I'm curious what this cycle tells us about turnout. What happened? What didn't happen? What was notable? What does the data tell us?
Yeah, so there was a big question going into this election whether or not Trump supporters would come out if Trump were not on the ballot, and would we see, very large spike because of Democratic enthusiasm against the administration, or how that would play out. And it was sort of a mixed bag. So in Virginia, the turnout in this gubernatorial election was about the same as it was in 2021. So we didn't see a huge increase, but it was definitely disproportionate. The Democrats turned out a little bit above average and Republicans a little bit below. If you look at New Jersey, there was a big increase in turnout there. And I think that was what perhaps drove the margin in that race above where people had been expecting it going in based on the polls. If you look at New York City, that was really the largest increase we saw. We had more than 2 million voters show up in the city mayoral election. We hadn't seen that since the 1960s, though the turnout rate was about what it was when Rudy Giuliani first ran for mayor back in 1993. So I think that's tapping into some of the discontent that was out there based on some of these cost of living issues and other things that we saw, in the exit polling data after the election last night.
Right, and that New Jersey turnout data might sort of suggest or explain the margin of victory, where the Democratic nominee was sort of favored, but the margin certainly outpaced any of the recent polling in that race.
Yeah. The other thing I would note is in California was a very unique situation in that there was no body on the ballot. Right. So you were telling people, go vote for something.
Yeah.
And turnout in that, there haven't been a lot of recall or referendum only, initiative only elections in California. And the turnout has been typically between sort of low 30s to high 30s. And this was definitely on the high end of turnout in California. Again, showing a level of enthusiasm for, for not just I've got a favorite candidate or I want to throw somebody out, but issues that are of concern broadly.
Well, and that one was sort of uniquely positioned, maybe more so than a governor's race or a mayor's race, as sort of a check on President Trump, a check on Republican control of Washington, D.C., and the proponents vastly outspent the opponents. So again, the outcome was never really much in doubt. Margin, though, certainly interesting. Todd, let's turn to the policy impact. We're in day 36 of this government shutdown. Do you think the results of the election change the dynamics of how either party approaches the current impasse?
I do, and it's something that, as has been discussed, that we've discussed, frankly. I think that there was a concern about, sort of ending the shutdown before the election and how that might affect turnout among the Democratic base. So that was clearly in the minds of, I think, a number of senators, particularly Senator Schumer, tried to say, no, we gotta corral ourselves until this is over. We know that the Senate Democrats had a long lunch yesterday, disproportionately long lunch, where they were discussing how do we get out of this. We also know that there are about a dozen Democratic senators who are ready to sort of find that off ramp. So I personally, do I think necessarily that this election ends this more quickly? Than it might have. I don't think we're going to see an acceleration into this week. We see an outcome, but I do think that the trajectory toward ending the shutdown is there. And I think Democrats, if as I understand it, as I see it, they're going to say, look, we've proved our point. Look what happened in New Jersey, in Virginia, in California, et cetera. We've made our point. We don't need to just drag this out for the sake of dragging it out. I do think one thing in terms of strategy may be different, and that is, I do think Democrats may be more insistent on a December date if we're going to have another CR, because I think they're going to say, look, if we're going to end this without agreeing on the ACA premium tax credits, we're going to resolve it before the end of the year. So kicking it into January, I think, becomes less likely as a consequence of this. That's
interesting. So if given maybe the margin of victory, where the Democrats might insist on another bite at the apple before January 1. Yeah, frankly, the margin made me think maybe this gets a little harder to get out of because an off-ramp requires some sort of compromise, and you've just had a great election as a party. Your incentive to compromise might be a little bit reduced because you're like, well, we're winning, right? The voters have rewarded us for our current behavior path. Karl, when you look at these off-year results and redistricting changes in particular, are there particular states or competitive districts where the map may still shift heading into 2026?
Yeah, so there are a couple of things on that. One is on the sort of performance of the Republican Party, say in some of the Hispanic districts and other minority districts. It looks like they gave back many of the gains that Trump had achieved in 2024, but not all of them. And so I think there will be a little bit of a question of how close are we on some of those districts. If you look at the redistricting exercise sort of as a whole, AP did an analysis last year that showed Republicans had about 16 or 17 more seats in the House than you might think if you took sort of the average number of votes in each state. Democrats had about 19 or 20 more seats than you might have expected based on the average, so about a 2 or 3 seat
sort of
additional delta for Democrats. And so I think, as you look at some of these redistricting exercises, right, we're likely to see in California, a big opportunity to make some gains there for both parties sort of doubling down on the states where they already have an advantage. So California, Democrats probably have, based on that AP analysis, about 6 more seats than you might expect, but they're probably going to push that and try to pick up another 3 or 4 or 5. Republicans have gains in Florida and North Carolina of about 5 seats combined there. We already saw North Carolina move and trying to add an additional one there. There's talk of doing more in Florida, and sort of course, Texas is out there where Republicans have about a 1 or 2 seat additional, and rather than sort of using the redistricting to get the gains by balancing out, it looks like we're doubling down on the places where there's already a significant advantage.
Right.
I mean, the only thing I would add there is I do think, to Karl's point about the sort of where those gains, the gains that President Trump made among Latino voters, et cetera, in New Jersey and Texas, et cetera, one of the things when you're redistricting and you're sort of saying, oh, well, we're going to take a Trump plus 15 district and make it a Trump plus 7 district. Given, for example, in Virginia, every county in Virginia yesterday, sort of unsurprisingly given the outcome, went bluer than it did in 2024. Some dramatically, some less so, but still the shift was clearly, toward the Democrats. Does that make some of those state legislators sort of rethink maybe going from Trump 15 to Trump 8 isn't as sensible as it may be, because maybe that 8 is really part of, the Latino vote in Passaic County. If that goes away, then that plus 8 is now at neutral or whatever.
Right.
So does it make those state legislators sort of rethink this project?
So that actually leads me maybe to the last question, which is, was there anything about last night's results or this morning's data that makes you rethink your prior held conviction about who might control the House or the Senate after the midterm elections?
I mean, look, as a Democrat who's been doom scrolling for the last year, I do think that it's a bright moment. But we're a year and a million news cycles from now until the next election. I do think that one of the things that I saw that I thought was unusual for Democrats was in Virginia and New Jersey in particular, a discipline about the message. It was about affordability. We did not see Spanberger and Sherrill like sort of following the bouncing ball of the latest thing that the president did or Republicans in Congress did. It was really like affordability, affordability, affordability. I think if Democrats can figure out what that message is and have that same sort of message discipline, and that's a heavy lift in my observation, I think that, maybe it does give them a little more advantage than I previously would have predicted. The Senate, still a really tough road. But at the same time, does Ohio become a little less red, a little more competitive for Sherrod Brown, even though we both know that comebacks are always hard?
Right.
Does it help him? And if it helps him, does it help Roy Cooper, some of the others running? But the same thing, you could have, I don't know how Mike Rogers is going to run in Michigan, but, he might choose to tack a little more center than latching, than hanging himself on the president. And maybe that helps him. So I think that there are lessons to be learned from last night's election. History would tell us that Democrats have a better than even chance of taking back the House. The Senate's still a hard race. I'm not sure that anything about last night changes my view of that, but it may improve their prospects in the House.
Karl, any
And
final
to
thoughts here?
Yeah, and to that point on history, I think that's what we really saw playing out last night. For decades, it's been the case that in these Virginia and New Jersey governor's races, which are the only ones that are sort of in that first year after presidential, they often go to the party that's not in power in the White House. And I think that's what we saw last night. You see that shift back. I think that would make me see it a little bit more likely to say that Democrats are likely to have gains in the midterms based on that, because that's the natural course of history has been in these races.
Right.
So I'm a little bit more sure in that than I was maybe last night. But as Todd points out, it's a lot of time between now and then.
Sure. All right. With that, we're going to have to bring it to a close. Thank you for joining me this morning.
Thanks.
Thank you.
So there are 12 months between today and the 2026 midterm elections, and our team in Washington is following developments, asking questions, and analyzing what this all means for you. Stay with Policy on Demand for more, and take care.